A lot of great questions here. Certainly, Jeff, to your point, it's very difficult to quantify at the leadership level what it really means to do IVM effectively and positively impact or provide net positive impact to the lands that are managed. And beyond it being the right thing to do, which is rarely really accepted by leadership, I guess I would tag on a little bit in terms of sustainable, responsible investment and the future of what that means to the investment community, particularly our investor-owned utilities. Because currently there's about $4 trillion in the market for SRI. And as we see wealth being passed down and grown, I think Generation S, the next sustainable investment community, the cohort that's rising beneath us, are going to make different choices about where they want to put their investment capital. And that, again, it's very difficult to quantify, but a lot of investment companies like BlackRock are beginning to really diversify their portfolios towards the businesses that are doing more sustainable business practices on the ground and who are able to then express it through their corporate social responsibility reporting, or nice segue into ESG. So how do we connect integrated vegetation management or integrated habitat management to environmental, social, and governance disclosures? All in 20 minutes, and I'm standing between you and snack. So I've got a captive audience. Just a little overview of what we'll take a look at. Linking IVM BMPs through time. We did a great job. The folks in the field did a great job of talking about what integrated vegetation management is in terms of that long-term planning. Some ESG indices and biodiversity disclosure options, quantitative and qualitative. And then the biodiversity disclosure processes, which in and of themselves I could talk about for at least an hour. So know that the materials are a little bit abbreviated, but I'm more than happy to have that conversation at any point, either while we're here or in the future. This is a little bit of a busy diagram, but this in a nutshell is how I view integrated vegetation management and integrated habitat management. There are lots of different views on what integrated vegetation management is. And in my 5 years of talking with individuals about different programs, I'm not one to say who is and who is not doing integrated vegetation management, because I don't think that's very polite. And really, I'm not going to say that because I think it's a continuum of maturity. And when we look at that IVM flow chart with all of its, all of its glory, what it really is it's an adaptive management cycle. So IVM, you can be at a very early stage in IVM. We could consider that to be post-2003 blackout, NERC regulations, or you could be much more advanced within the system. IVM is a toolkit, right? And at the top here, we have integrated vegetation management moving towards integrated habitat management. And we have 5 different methods. The biological prescribed fire, which is on there because it's in the IVM BMP, but not many people are doing that in the utility realm. Cultural methods, chemical methods, and physical methods. And most utility partners are focusing on chemical methods and physical methods. And you can easily be on the left side here where you're focusing more on non-selected BMPs as part of your reclamation and first cycle maintenance. I guess the distinction I would make here is that I have worked with a number of utilities that are in that PERT plus model, which is the rinse and repeat. So spray and pray every 4 years. And that I would really not consider to be an advanced IVM model. Really what we're trying to work towards is ultimately that goal of the biological method where you're conserving that compatible early successional low growing plant and shrub communities. I should probably read like grass, forest, fern, shrub communities through a variety of different increasingly selective IVM best management practices. You're never going to get away from non-selective methods. They're always going to come back. There's going to be a need for sidewall trimming, hotspot maintenance, depending on your long-term management objectives. But the point is, we have a very large toolkit to use for integrated vegetation management. And I think a lot of people in this room are really moving towards and definitely heavily involved in that more selective application And that drives us towards more of a discussion of integrated vegetation management becoming integrated habitat management. When we look at ESG indices, these are the main players that I deal with primarily in my work and that I see other utilities working with. We have the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the Global Reporting Initiative, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, Carbon Disclosure Project, and then the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They vary in their level of exclusivity. Only the DJSI is invitation only. The rest of them are open to all. So the GRI, SASB, CDP, UN SDGs, any particular utility or partner can develop the specific metrics for those and voluntarily disclose them. All of these are voluntary, even the invitation only, DJSI. Some companies are invited to disclose ESG and choose not to. And then this is the big one here, disclosure categories as quantitative or qualitative. I tend to focus more on the quantitative side because that's where this is tofu and potatoes, right, at the table. The qualitative side, anybody can do. It's storytelling, it's good pictures, and this is your highest risk for greenwashing biodiversity, which I'm personally not a big fan of. And what I mean by that is if you're a utility and you manage 100,000 acres, for example, maybe you've got 190 real estate and you actively manage 100,000, and you're mostly stuck in that structural rinse and repeat method, but you have 4 acres of really nice installed pollinator plots, and that's what goes in your CSR, and that's what you talk about. That's fine, but you're looking at 0.0004% of your overall network, and I think the intent of most people in the room here is to talk about how we can better manage the service territory for enhanced biodiversity. It's the DJSI and the GRI that are primarily quantitative, and we'll get into what that looks like. They also have a qualitative element, but in my opinion, the strongest elements are those quantitative metrics where we can then begin to build the qualitative narrative to match. I apologize to the people in the back of the room. This is, I didn't expect the text to be so small, but as I said, I could talk about this for an hour. These are the main processes. No need to read all of them individually. What's important really is at the top, and what's below is really just a description of what we have. So you can sort of think about these in terms of chronological order, starting from left to right. Early on, the quantitative components of the DJSI and the GRI are going to be asking for a biodiversity exposure evaluation. And what that is a desktop analysis of protected areas, biologically important areas, outside of protected areas, and then sensitive species habitat, or moreover, like potential range for rare, threatened, and endangered species. And it's essentially a biodiversity risk exposure assessment. That bleeds nicely into organizational scoping, where then you can talk about, well, okay, we've got biodiversity hotspots, so-called, defined by the IUCN and others, on our system. What are we going to do with them? Who does biodiversity management apply to? Does it apply to our generation, transmission, and distribution, or do we want to limit it to our larger land base of transmission? And then to whom does it apply? On down the line to develop those preliminary biodiversity conservation targets and metrics. That leads into a biodiversity commitment. This is a nice way to lock the company into essentially a commitment to move integrated vegetation management into integrated habitat management. It's a publicly available commitment that the company makes to manage for biodiversity on lands that we manage. A commitment is really just the beginning. One of the next stages is really taking a look at behavior change planning and implementation. Been having a lot of interesting conversations with folks in the room at lunch and breakfast about this process, because as you know, behavior change is a very slow process, requires a lot of planning, a lot of socialization, and a lot of training. It's quite difficult to change behavior, not only of an individual, but of an entire organization. And important points there are really just taking a look at, evaluating institutional knowledge and developing tools to enhance IVM skills and practices. Ultimately, that gets into the question over here of biodiversity assessments and integration. What metrics are we using? What systems are we using to measure biodiversity on our lands? Hopefully, it's based on the developed targets and metrics that we set earlier on in the process, and then we begin to integrate that into work planning and IVM processes. Okay, going through each of these individually, this is that desktop analysis. A number of these, we do this from an armchair with a powerful desktop and some GIS, and this is taking a look at your geographic footprint or your actively managed areas for those protected areas, biologically important areas outside of protected areas, and globally and nationally sensitive species. These are the quantitative requests from the DJSI and the GRI, taking a look at, do we have any World Heritage sites that overlap? Do we have any IUCN protected areas? Specifically, they ask for categories 1 through 4, but there's also category 5, 6, and other. Key biodiversity areas or KBAs, critical habitat, red list species, and Fish and Wildlife Service complete CNE species ranges. But this is just data. This is not information. You can spit this out into large reference sheets, but it's just the beginning of the process. We need to begin to work through a data refinement operation to ask ourselves, what is actually the biodiversity that we want to manage for? And should we even limit it to the protected areas? I would argue that no, we don't want to limit it to the protected areas, because these are generally our mountainscapes, our rock and ice, all the places that we've preserved, conserved, because we don't live there. We'd prefer to live in the more biodiverse areas like the alluvial landscapes where we do our agriculture and build our homes. Organizational scoping, this one's really important, and it's beginning to be asked for within the various ESG indices. And I guess I'll back up for just a second, because what has happened is they've increasingly asked for specific metrics over time. Over the last 5 years, most of the specific ESG indices have gone from qualitative to a combination now of quantitative as well. And they're becoming more specific over time. And that's a slow behavior change process that they're asking for from their disclosures. But it's moving companies, individuals in the right direction to set targets and not just talk about stories. So to which operations does biodiversity management apply? What values and risks do we face to manage for or not manage for biodiversity? To whom does it apply? Which habitats are we interested in? How do we define our operations, and do they directly or indirectly, positively or negatively impact biodiversity? And on down the line, there's actually a much larger framework, but it's a few questions for the page here. And this is a point I'd like to land on a little bit, because this term gets thrown around a lot. These terms of no net loss and net positive impact. What do those really mean? This is sort of a stylized approach to what this means, but on the left here we have biodiversity value, negative dipping below the dotted line, positive being above. And I think we can consider new construction or reclamation of a right-of-way to be basically predicted biodiversity impact. And this happens a lot with the siting process in new construction, but I would also argue that it applies to reclamation. Throughout that siting process, companies often employ what's known as a mitigation hierarchy to avoid, minimize, restore, and offset the predicted biodiversity impact. And so being sort of stylized, we can tack on some benefit for avoidance, some more for minimization, restoration, ultimately hoping that offsetting brings us up to what we might call no net loss, the no net loss threshold. And that's compensating for whatever biodiversity might have been lost for the siting or the reclamation. Where this becomes really important is that, depending on the site, I guess I would say that I'm not confident that a true mitigation hierarchy will always bring you up to a no net loss threshold. And that's where the idea of additional conservation actions, or in parentheses IVM here, can contribute to that net positive impact. So we can reclaim a site every 12 years, rinse and repeat, come back in another 12 when vegetation is threatening the lines again. But I would not argue that that necessarily provides additional conservation actions or integrated vegetation management. And that's why I think IVM is so important to surpassing the no net loss threshold and providing that positive net impact or biodiversity value, conservation benefit. There are lots of different ways to refer to it on the ground. Ultimately, these processes lead into that biodiversity commitment. There are a number of them out there that you can research. Since they are publicly available, you'll find them on various websites. I pulled this one down from First Energy, where you can see they basically claim that we did that biodiversity exposure evaluation. We apply a mitigation hierarchy, and we're working towards targeted biodiversity management. So setting our targets for the values for the information that we're able to derive from the data. Most of these require at minimum every 5 years repeat, but I think a best management practice would be honestly to revisit every 2 years, see if the standards have changed, see if any of the adaptive management triggers need to be in place. And then the elephant in the room, behavior change planning and implementation. This is the hardest one of changing practices, but it's entirely possible. My recommendation here would be consider developing an internal team to manage that behavior change planning and implementation. That's setting your desired condition and a timeline with that, saying, in 5 years, in 10 years, we want to achieve this level of biodiversity or this level of skill and implementation in the field to promote biodiversity. And we're going to work that back in a Gantt chart, decide who it applies to, and put the plan in place. But having a specialized team internally to help run that, especially if it reaches across departments, very important. Otherwise, tends to get shelved. Just being honest. Evaluating current institutional capacity and understanding the challenges. You want to make this a data-driven approach. What is the current level of institutional knowledge and IVM application to meet that desired condition? What are the conditions we need to set? What are the tools that are either out there that we can adopt, or ones that we might want to develop internally? Define those resources, develop a multi-year plan, and continue to work through the process, ultimately getting to training skills, socializing and training concepts and skills internally and externally. And then basically conducting field assessments is the point of what tools do you really use to monitor, and then integrating that long-term vision and taking a look at your monitoring program every few years, understanding whether you need to apply any adaptive management approaches. That is IVM, IHM, ESG in less than 20 minutes. Sorry, that was a little bit of a whirlwind, but take any questions in the remaining time that we have.
I have time for one. That's good.
And really basic question maybe, but in your eye, what's the biggest group that ESG is targeted at? I'm thinking like investors who they want to money or just really schools of ESG outside of regulation.
If I understand your question correctly, it is, how do they develop their metrics? Where do they want to see companies go?
I'm trying to figure out, without sounding too cavalier, I guess, what the point of quantitative ESG is outside of accountants coming in and auditing someone, because it seems like someone who's investing, not to maximize profits initially. We love a good story. I love a good story.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering if it's a long-term goal so that the everyday investor does care about the quantitative stuff, or if it's more about like industry specific, keeping everyone accountable.
Right. There's definitely an accountability issue. I think given the trends that we've seen in specifically the biodiversity sections of these indices over the last 5 years is a recognition that there's greenwashing going on in all industries. And these are not utility specific. These are every company from Coca-Cola to First Energy. And they all have different geographical footprints, but I think what's going on, and I can't confirm this, to take it with a grain of salt, but they were recognizing that it's great. You can tell a very nice story about 2 acres, but you're actually affecting 90 to 100,000. So I think it's basically calling companies out to say, please put your money where your mouth is and prove it.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.